G'day, welcome to the lecture. Now we have a task to perform. Our task, or mission if you will, is to create a dashboard solution for one of our users. Now the user doesn't really know exactly what they want. They only have a broad understanding of the subject matter that they want to analyse. Consequently, we need to derive a set of specifications, requirement specifications from our user. But we need a way to do this that's efficient. In other words, we don't want to spend too much time going backwards and forwards because we've misunderstood something the user requested, and consequently spend a lot of money building our app. So what we can do here, and in most instances when you build a project, you will follow some sort of methodology. Now the reason I'm going to teach you an abridged methodology here is to get your mindset around the whole notion of development via some sort of structured approach. Now these structured approaches can actually be agile. In other words, we can work on an agile methodology if we choose, or use a methodology that's been set up within the data analytics team for all development. So in this particular lecture, what we're going to do is use an abridged methodology, as you see on the screen here, and work through each step to establish a set of requirements that we can go back to the user with. And of course, we work with the user during this process to get sign-off and then commence development with some degree of confidence that what we provide is what they've requested. Now, the reason we're learning this here too is to get your mindset in that paradigm, if you will, for when you're developing via the business analysis section and the data architect section, because your whole approach in this type of thought process will be tested in your certification exams. And if you demonstrate this approach well, then the chances of you passing are very high. So let's work through the slides now in detail to establish what the requirements are for our user in this project. So I'm going to see you in a minute and work through the slides shortly. Now what you can see on the screen are a set of bubbles, and the arrows between them, the direction they follow, indicates the logical steps of our data analytics life cycle. So the first one we're going to discuss is the objective definition and the sub-items that compose that definition requirement. So you'll see domain identification, data source identification, and develop hypothesis. So let's work through those individually now. So our objective definition, by definition, excuse the pun, getting started in a BI project, no matter the size and complexity, for the most part, we'll start with the business management team, a user group, or a single user with some authority, communicating with the data analyst team to get together to talk about their requirement. Now, as a data analyst, we will have some primary questions to ask the user. These are fundamental to your methodology. That way you can build the structure and rigor into how we communicate in a two-way process to our user. Now, the first problem we may encounter is that the user may not actually have any idea what they want to see, or at least they cannot articulate their requirements. They may have this intuitive feel for what they want to see, and they're used to exploring things themselves to arrive at these conclusions. So it makes it difficult at times for the user to actually state what they actually want to see on a dashboard, assuming they even understand what a dashboard is. So typically when this happens, I will ask the user, well, what gets you out of bed in the morning? Now, this is purely a hypothetical, and we're talking about numbers here, nothing else. So what we're saying is, when you get to work, what are you actually thinking about before you arrive? What are you going to look up to see how your business or organisation is performing? Now, in this case, we're in a healthcare setting, so their response may be, well, are our patient care costs too high in proportion to our income? Or what is the ratio of male to female patients? And another very important one that I've encountered in healthcare is the average length of stay, LOS. In other words, are we actually allowing patients to spend more time than necessary? And I'm not talking about the humanity of this, I'm just talking about the statistics. Is it such that specific treatments only require a length of stay, for example, of 5 days, but for some reason that patient is staying for 3 weeks? What is the reason for that? Are there complications and so forth? So they're the sorts of questions we're going to tease out of our user. So at this point now, we're going to identify the domain because we're connecting with them and we've broken the ice and started the dialogue. So in this case, our domain is the patient care costing, and that's the model for our analysis. Now this is the time to commence the dialogue around their requirements. And it might be very high level at this point, but the thing is we're getting a dialogue happening. So for example, we might open with, right, it seems that you require a dashboard of sorts for your cost analysis. And the user might still look perplexed at you, but nonetheless, we're starting to implant a seed of an idea into their head. At that point, it's probably worth saying, well, from a data source perspective, in other words, data source identification, where is the data located? And this enables the analyst to have an overall notion of what application manages this data. So the user's going to come back and say, well, yes, it's maintained in our patient management system. So then we can develop a hypothesis. So we've got this thought process in our brain, and we might actually then say, well, and this is based upon past experience perhaps, some of the more common things we might suggest that we put into this hypothesis is suggest points of interest, in other words, supposition, such as, well, patient counts, revenue received, the costs, practitioner profitability. So again, all these things are starting to swirl around the dialogue and the user's thinking more about what's happening with the data and the application and what they expect to see to assist with their day-to-day decision-making process. Now, even though we say understanding data and requirements, I've mentioned that this looks a bit cart before the horse. I like to understand the requirements first before I go back and start looking at the data. So during the discussions, we've established that a single dashboard should be designed and built to provide insight. So at this point, we could nominate the dashboard scope. So the scope in this instance will be patient costing analysis. The user, based upon our discussions, has identified, well, the CEO's interested in some specific analytics, as are other parts of the team. They have some geo-analytics. In other words, they want to see distribution of patient origins across the globe for specific measures or metrics, and perhaps some behaviour, statistical behaviour. So we might be looking at scatter plots, for example. And we may actually ask, how do you want to see this dashboard delivered? Well, because it's fairly confidential, at this point they've just requested that the dashboard app be viewed via a desktop. In other words, we're not going to let it outside of our immediate organisation, so we're probably not going to put it on a tablet or a phone at this particular juncture of the project. So now we have some basic requirements, but we want to take this further. So with this in mind, analyst and user have established the questions that need to be answered on this dashboard. So the broad metrics, in other words, that the user requires are patient counts, averages for length of stay and age. We want to highlight revenue, cost and profit, previous year and month cost comparisons, year-based profitability, practitioner profitability, patient activity, gender ratio, average length of stay by specialty and cost, average length of stay by age group and profitability, and some geo-analytics around patient origins, showing counts, revenue, cost, length of stay, profitability, and so forth. So quite a few things came out of the discussions, but these are still fairly high level. So in a way, we've identified the high level requirements for our project. And of course, other considerations for the dashboard interaction are made. So the user said, oh, I'd really like to see the ability to drill down by date. So it could be year, month, and individual date elements, or drill down by age groups to age. And indeed, I want to filter data by admission years, genders, specialty, and so forth. So with all that information that's suddenly flowing into our requirements list, then of course we need to start exploring, well, how are we actually going to calculate all this? We need to understand more about the data, but let's look at some high-level rules to understand how our calculations will work. Now that we have a broad list of the requirements for the user's solution, we actually need to ask just a couple more questions to tie up some loose ends. So the first one, we're going to pose the question, do you have any idea how you want the dashboard to be laid out? And of course, by then you should have actually established this with the user, and their answer will be yes, of course. So what we'll do then with the user is start to either use a drafting tool such as Balsamiq, which is a wireframe tool, or even just a piece of graph paper and a pencil and ruler to try to build up a visualization to help the user decide where everything should be. And then we'll ask where the data is. Well, we established that earlier on in the process. However, the user's now told us we need to contact the system admin people for access to this data. And because this is an enterprise that uses many different tools for visualization, we'll actually confirm with the user what tool they'd like to see it in. And we've demonstrated various tools, and they've come back and said, well, Qlik Sense seems to be the best for our particular requirement, so we'll develop using Qlik Sense, which makes sense because that's what this course is about, isn't it? Now, earlier we saw that there was a reference to the business rules page. Now, what happens here is that we need to identify the way calculations are worked with the data that we're going to extract. Now, I won't work through each individual one here because I don't want to put you to sleep. We'll refer back to these as we actually build our dashboard in the coming lectures. But just rest assured, you do need to build a set of rules that guide the calculations you're going to write. You can't actually assume anything in this process, because at the end of the day, what you interpret as a logical step to build a calculation and end result could be actually quite badly flawed in its approach. So it's always best to work very closely with your users or stakeholders and subject matter experts to ensure that the calculation you use is correct. In other words, make sure that the expression or the algorithm is accurate and signed off by the user. And we'll see more of that later in the course when we look at data governance. And of course, the user has specified a few formatting guidelines. So again, I won't work through each individual one, but just for example, they might say, well, revenue, it should be a specific color when certain values are reached. So in this case, we're saying highlight blue when we're over $1 million, or yellow if we're below $1 million. So at that point, we have to understand the visual acuity that will be relevant to the user and their business process. Now what we did, we took Balsamiq, in this case, which is a wireframe mock-up tool that I use for developing prototypes, and started to build, based upon my working with the user, how things will look. So we established that we have 3 individual sheets within our solution. And the first one on the screen here is the CEO overview. Try and say that quickly. And that's the page with the various metrics they want to see and the filters. So for example, an average length of stay, and those elements across the top are known as KPIs within Qlik Sense. But again, we'll refer backwards and forwards to these individual pages so that we can build our solution based upon what the user would like to see in the overall layout. So as I say, we have an overview page, we have a geoanalytics, which is a set of maps for various metrics the user wants to see and an ability to drill down. And then of course some behaviours. So we have some scatter plots on display here, and then a previous year, previous month cost value based upon selections by the user. And at that point, we've gone back to the user with the final draft and they've approved the layout. So what are we going to do next? Well, it's time to look at our data sourcing and cleansing. So as I say before, now that we have an understanding of requirements, we can get more of an understanding of the data. So we'll cover that in the next lecture. So fundamentally, we're going to look at what tables and what columns are required for development of our project. And of course, we've been told we cannot have direct access to the management system. And this is not unusual. I work with extracts a lot in the healthcare space because the actual source systems are highly confidential, and I have to discuss the extract requirements and how often they're processed with that particular administration team. Now, what we'll do in the next lecture is identify this data and prepare the data to be loaded to the Qlik Sense solution data model. Now, this particular specification is available for you to download from this lecture. So you'll see it there, you can download it, print it out, and you can refer backwards and forwards as we continue to move forward with the lectures. So what I'll do now is see you in the next lecture where we start talking about the data that we're going to use in this solution. Bye for now.